Virgo is the sixth sign in the zodiac and is active from August 23rd to September 22nd, which means the Earth sign lies between Leo and Libra, which are fire and air signs respectively. The name Virgo is Latin for virgin, which sounds like a joke I would make, but it's actually true. Now, if anyone can explain to me how this symbol represents a virgin, I'd be very keen to hear it, because I've already read through multiple theories and all of them were trash. When it comes to the constellation though, there's actually a resemblance for once. It's said to embody a virgin goddess of harvest, possibly Demeter, maybe Persefone, it could be Astraea, or even Origone. We'll get into all that in just a minute, but first I want to share some alleged Virgo personality traits. You Virgins are an interesting bunch, and by interesting, I mean not the kind of person I'd want to hang out with. No disrespect, of course, it's just that according to the primary resource I use in my research, Mythic Astrology, you're known for being cold, fussy, and analytical. You're extremely hard workers, which is a commendable trait no doubt, but you're a little too critical, not just of others, but of yourself as well. The good news is your criticism of others can come from a place of caring. For example, you might harshly critique a paper your friend wrote or tell them they suck at their job, not because you're mean, because you want them to do their best. In fact, it's this care for others that often leads Virgos to become nurses, therapists, and fill other supportive roles. The problem is you could be so concerned with the well-being of others that you end up neglecting your own needs, which is not a good habit when you're so critical of yourself. I also read that Virgins tend to get addicted to their pursuits and will often work themselves to a breaking point where they're forced to take some time off, which interestingly enough mirrors Persephone's annual descent to the underworld. Speaking of, you know how I said that she and her mother are usually said to be who the constellation represents? Well, personally, I think the alternative identities are a lot more interesting, and unlike Demeter and Persephone, I haven't told their stories about a dozen times each. So today we're focusing on the myths containing Astraea and Origone. If you do want to hear the story of Persephone though, watch my episode about her. It's a good one. Now when it comes to Astraea, I admittedly had never heard of her before researching for this episode, but that's a shame because she has a pretty interesting role as the last of the immortals to live among the humans. So for those who don't know, the Greek poet Hesiod, who is our primary resource for the Greek creation story, claimed there were 5 ages of man that eventually led to the birth of mankind as we know it. The first was the Golden Age, which occurred during the reign of Zeus's father, Cronus. Back then, men lived like gods and didn't have a damn thing to worry about. No one had to work or was ever unhappy. There was no war either. It was always springtime and men lived long lives before dying painlessly in their sleep. The Silver Age started after Zeus and his siblings defeated the Titans. At this point, mankind lived simple lives, but had to work, plant crops, and build houses to sustain themselves. Their biggest flaw was that they didn't worship the gods properly, and this irritated Zeus, who was expecting at least a few sacrifices, so he destroyed them. The Bronze Age was a rough one. These men were made from ash trees, a hardwood that was used for spears. Incidentally, this is also what the Norse people believed men to be made of. According to Hesiod, the Bronze Age men were strong and violent. Their armor and houses were made of bronze, and they preferred eating meat over fruits and vegetables. The almighty Zeus considered these men to be monsters and destroyed them with a great flood. Next comes the Age of Heroes. When you hear stories about Heracles, Theseus, and Odysseus, this is the age those take place. Mankind was generally better than the previous iterations, but there were still evil outliers. The Iron Age is the one that Hesiod considered himself to be living in, and I suppose the one that we inhabit as well. At this point, people are more evil and selfish than ever before. Life is suffering by default, and it requires an incredible amount of work to avoid that. Hesiod predicted that Zeus would eventually destroy this race and start again, to which I have to say, what are you waiting for, man? Now's as good a time as any. So this is where the myth gets a little confusing, because depending on which poet you source from, the role that Astraea fills could be taken by the goddess Nemesis. For example, Hesiod, whose work we've been following thus far, claims it was Nemesis, but Ovid and Aratus say Astraea. Both versions are near identical save for the ending, but I'm going with Ovid and Aratus's versions because they have a little more detail than Hesiod's. So in the days of old, or should I say gold, Astraea walked freely among the humans and had everyday interactions with them. She bestowed gifts like grain, fruit, and wine and imparted some of her godly wisdom. She encouraged a way of living where people were morally good and helped each other, but this didn't last as long as she was hoping. At the start of the Silver Age, men began arguing with one another. They would lie, cheat, steal, and worst of all, refuse to honor the gods properly. Astraea was so worried for their well-being that she brought them all together to give a warning. Shape up now or you're going to be destroyed. Unfortunately, that warning fell on deaf ears though, and when Astraea realized her efforts to aid were pointless, she left for the mountains and chose to watch mankind from a distance. But as you can imagine, after the Silver Aegeans were wiped out by Zeus and the even more selfish and violent Bronze Aegeans took over, Astraea found herself even more disgusted than ever, and it was at this point that she decided she had enough. She took off to the heavens and turned herself into the constellation known as Virgo, where she could still watch humanity from a safe distance without being a part of our morally detestable world. And before anyone comments calling out the Olympians for being corrupt and selfish and all the horrible things that we humans are, I think that's the reason Astraea decided to become one with the stars instead of living on Olympus. And as depressing as that is, I've got another myth that makes that one's ending look like a happily ever after. It concerns a man from Athens named Icarius. He was a hardworking farmer who managed to make an honest living by raising livestock with the help of his shepherds, whom he truly appreciated and considered to be family. Icarius was also an adamant worshiper of Dionysus, the god of wine, and one day, to pay him back for his many sacrifices and prayers, the god gave Icarius a special bottle of wine. Icarius, not being a selfish person, decided to give the bottle to his shepherds, whom he owed much of his success to, only this proved to be a horrible idea, because the wine Dionysus gave Icarius was extremely potent, like the stuff that Heracles drank before going crazy and slaughtering a small battalion of centaurs, and if a demigod couldn't handle it, you can bet the simple shepherds had no chance. They got very drunk very quickly and thought that Icarius had poisoned them, so in a drunken rage that resembled Heracles's, they used stones to beat him to death. To make it even worse, they left his body to be discovered by his daughter Origone and his loyal dog Myra, who were so heartbroken at the discovery that they couldn't go on. After burying her father with his coins for Charon the boatman, Origone hung herself and Myra jumped in a well. Now Dionysus, who felt horrible about the suffering that his gift brought the family, was also furious at the Athenians for their behavior. Not only did they murder a genuinely good man, but a man that was a loyal worshiper of the god, and that was crossing a line. The specifics of his punishment vary between drought and mania depending on the version, but the end result is always the same. All of the Bible maidens living in Athens go insane and hang themselves in the same manner as Origone. Then, to honor the family that did not deserve the misery that was brought upon them, Dionysus turned them all into constellations. Origone became Virgo, no surprise there. Icarius was placed as the constellation Boötes, and even the dog Myra got her own constellation as Canis Major.
Persefone. Persefone was a Greek goddess and dual deity who presided over vegetation here on Earth as well as helped rule the underworld. I know, kind of a weird combination of specialties, but there's a reason for it. She's the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, the goddess of harvest and agriculture, as well as the wife of Hades, the god of the underworld. What's also interesting about Persephone is there were multiple variations of her name in the ancient Greek world, including Persephonea, Persephassa, Persephata, and Pharapaha, to name just a few. I'm definitely saying those wrong, by the way, but I'm giving myself a gold star for trying. Scholars believe that Persephone having so many names, and with them being hard for people to pronounce even back then, is evidence that she existed in other religions that predated even the ancient Greeks, but more on that later. The goddess is also often portrayed wearing a robe and carrying a bundle of grain, but sometimes that grain is replaced by a scepter and a little box. Most commonly though, Persephone is portrayed in the process of being carried to the underworld by Hades, a myth we're deep diving into next. As I mentioned, Persephone ruled the underworld by Hades' side after he kidnapped and married her, but you're probably curious about how that went down, so let me fill you in. And by the way, the kidnapping of Persephone, also known as the rape of Persephone, begins with Hades taking an interest in his gorgeous god-niece, pun intended, and getting his brother Zeus's permission to kidnap her and take her to his realm. See, he knew that his sister Demeter would never allow her daughter to marry the god of the underworld, so he went above her head and asked Zeus, who had previously told him he could choose any one of his daughters to marry. Using the help of Gaia, the earth deity, Zeus and Hades set a trap for Persephone. While she was out picking flowers with the ocean nymphs and goddesses Athena and Artemis, they lured her away from them using a narcissus, a flower of great beauty. She became entranced by the flower, and when she picked it, the surface of the earth opened up below her and out flew Hades on his golden chariot pulled by immortal horses. He grabbed hold of Persephone and carried her to the underworld while she was kicking and screaming as loud as she could. Sadly though, despite her cries for help, not a single soul heard her besides Hecate, the goddess of magic and witchcraft, who had no idea where she was. Now, Persefone and her mom were like total BFFs, matching charm bracelets and everything, and like most gods and goddesses, Demeter was very protective of her daughter. As a result, after learning of her disappearance, Demeter wandered the earth with torches and searched for her for 9 days straight until Hecate came to her offering help. She said, "Demeter, I don't know where she is, but I know she didn't wander off on her own. I heard her cries for help from my cave, but I couldn't find her in time." This gave Demeter an idea. The two goddesses went to Helios, the god of the sun, who was watchman for both gods and humans alike, capable of seeing everything they do. They inquired if the all-seeing god saw what happened to Persefone, and because he had been watching Demeter search helplessly for some time now, he pitied her enough to answer truthfully that Zeus and Hades had set up the kidnapping. Naturally, this infuriated Demeter to no end. Out of spite for Zeus, she forbade the earth from producing any kind of harvest, thereby starving the humans and depriving the gods of their sacrifices. And she vowed to never again return to Mount Olympus until Persefone was returned. It didn't take long for Zeus to give in to the pressure from the hungry folks on earth, as well as the gods, who were like, "Zeus, what are you doing? I need my sacrifices." The god of gods sent his son Hermes down to the underworld to inform Hades about the recent events, and while he wasn't happy about it, the god of the underworld agreed to let his new bride go. He loaded up his chariot and returned Persefone to her mother, but the joyous reunion was short-lived as Demeter sensed something was wrong with her daughter right away. See, just before taking her back, Hades tricked Persefone into eating a pomegranate seed, and it was a rule that anyone who tasted food in the underworld would be forced to stay there. A pretty shitty rule, but since Persefone was a goddess, they made a partial exception for her. She would only have to be there for a third of every year, and during the other 2/3, she could be with her mother. As a result, during the time of year when Demeter and her daughter were together, the earth flourished with vegetation and color, but whenever she was in the underworld, the earth would once again become a barren realm. If you haven't made the connection just yet, this myth is how the ancient Greeks explained the seasons. Now I just want to know how they would explain global warming. Maybe Demeter's going through menopause or something. Another interesting detail I didn't include in my first telling is these events resulted in Persephone's god status to be bumped up a notch. To rectify his wrong, Zeus allowed Persephone to join him, her mother, and the other deathless gods on Mount Olympus. This meant she was now able to receive sacrifices. According to myth, after he made this change, a religious group called the Eleusinian Mysteries was established. It was a highly secretive cult that held ceremonies every year to honor Demeter and Persephone. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into much detail about the cult and its practices because it's a very complicated subject, but basically its members' goals were to secure themselves a more enjoyable prospect after death by conducting the proper ceremonies and sacrifices. If that's not enough info for you, I've linked to 2 separate lectures on the mysteries down below for you to check out after this video's done. But just a warning, they are very dense and might require some note-taking to retain all the information. Now, while Persephone was brought to Hades against her will, she ended up growing into the role of Queen of the Underworld rather quickly, and actually performed both good and deplorable deeds herself. For example, let's start with Adonis. He was a human mortal that both Persephone and Aphrodite fell in love with. As you all know by now, the gods were what I like to call loose gooses. They like to mess around. Also, I'm aware the correct term would be loose geese, but that doesn't rhyme, so moving on. Since the goddesses couldn't decide who deserved Adonis' love and more, Zeus got involved, and similar to Persephone, he divided the man's time into thirds. For 1/3 of the year, he'd be with Persephone, for 1/3 he'd be with Aphrodite, and for the last third, he could choose who he wanted to be with. However, when the time for him to choose came along, Adonis picked Aphrodite, which Persephone took very personally. The enraged goddess sent a wild boar to kill Adonis while he was on a hunting trip, and shortly after the attack, he died in Aphrodite's arms. All because Persephone couldn't get the D. Pretty f***ed up, right? What's funny about that though, and this is a common theme with the Greek gods, is that even though she was pulling a runaround Sue on Hades, she was not cool with him doing the same thing. When Persephone heard that his old lover Minth was bragging about being more beautiful than her and how she was going to win back Hades, the goddess raged and turned her into a mint plant. Some might say that's a bit of an overreaction, and I would be inclined to agree. Persephone wasn't always a hothead though. In some circumstances, she actually proved to have quite the soft spot. Take Orpheus as a for instance. He was a Greek musician with a supernatural ability to make beautiful music. One day, while Orpheus's wife was walking alone, she was assaulted by a satyr who attempted to rape her. She tried to get away from him, but in the process, she fell into a pit of vipers where she was fatally bitten. When Orpheus found her body later that day, he sang a song of such grief that the gods and nymphs wept and encouraged him to go to the underworld to bring her back. Now, if you've seen my video on Hades, you know that one of the foundational laws of the underworld is that once a human enters, they aren't allowed to leave. But Persefone was so touched by Orpheus's music that she convinced Hades to allow him to go free and take his wife, under one condition. He wasn't allowed to look behind him until he reached the Earth's surface. It sounds easy enough, but as he approached the exit, his wife still hadn't caught up with him. At the very last second, he made the mistake of turning around to see if she was there and to make sure he wasn't being tricked, and as a result, she disappeared right before his eyes and he never saw her again. The last myth involving Persefone that I want to mention follows two kings named Theseus and Pirithous. Searching for a new adventure, those two kings vowed to kidnap and marry the daughters of Zeus. Theseus chose Helen of Troy and was successful in his attempt, but Pirithous got a little cocky and chose Persephone. Now Hades was aware of this plan and decided to take action. When the two kings arrived in the underworld, he met with them and invited them to feast, and as soon as they sat down, stone snakes coiled around their legs, binding them to their chairs. If you've seen my video on the 12 labors of Hercules, you might remember that Theseus was eventually saved by Herc, but Pirithous was doomed to stay in the underworld forever as punishment for trying to steal the wife of a god. You gotta wonder if the guy's really brave or just really stupid, being that most humans were too scared to even say Hades' name, let alone kidnap his wife. Regardless, I'd say his arrogant self got the fate he deserved. All we can hope for is that his appearance in God of War 3 was based on true events. Now that you've learned all about Persefone and the myth she's most known for, let's talk about where her story came from. Because believe it or not, the myth of a god or goddess being taken to the underworld and becoming ruler was around long before the ancient Greeks and is known as the dying and rising god archetype. Similar stories appear in the ancient Eastern world and in the cults of male gods like Attis, Adonis, and Osiris. The one I want to unpack today, though, is a Sumerian myth that's older than each of those, or at least the Greek ones. Historians can't seem to agree on where exactly Egypt falls on the timeline anymore. In the Sumerian story, the goddess Ereshkigal is abducted by Kur, the primordial dragon, and forced to rule the underworld known as Urkala. In some renditions, the goddess's name is also Urkala, similar to the way Hades is both the name of the underworld and its ruler. Interestingly, the two stories she is most known for is her kidnapping and then her marriage to the god Nergal, who she ordered to be brought to the underworld after he disrespected the messenger she sent up to the banquet of gods. And while Ereshkigal finds herself stuck ruling the underworld forever, her abduction by the Kur is avenged. Enki, the god of water, set out in a boat to slay the Kur. The Kur defends itself by pelting Enki with rocks of many sizes and by sending the waves beneath Enki's boat to attack Enki. The poem never actually explains who the ultimate victor of the battle is, but it's implied that Enki wins. Mythology is so f***ing cool.